The six wives of Henry VIII are some of the most famous and often misunderstood women in history. Their names evoke drama, tragedy, and intrigue, but behind the headlines lies a tapestry of rich, complex lives shaped by love, ambition, faith, and survival. Far from being mere footnotes to a king's story, these women navigated a world of shifting power, ruthless politics, and cultural upheaval with remarkable resilience and intelligence. Their stories reveal not only the personal costs of life at court, but also the profound ways in which they shaped the course of English history. To truly understand Tudor England, we must look beyond the scandal and spectacle to see the individuality, strength, and lasting impact of Henry's wives. Tudor history has long captivated the imaginations of readers, historians, and artists alike. Its tapestry is rich with power struggles, religious upheaval, and dramatic personal transformations. At the heart of this enduring fascination lies one of England's most infamous monarchs, Henry VIII, and his six wives, a sequence of women often remembered by the fateful rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died; divorced, beheaded, survived. These women, so often reduced to their marital fates, have become characters in a centuries-long spectacle of intrigue, scandal, and tragedy. Yet behind the public drama lies a far more complex and human story, one that this work seeks to uncover. The six wives of Henry VIII have frequently been portrayed as symbols of their times, political pawns or cautionary tales, their identities flattened by the grandeur and violence of Tudor politics. Popular culture reinforces this with portrayals that emphasize their beauty, rivalry, or victimhood. Anne Boleyn becomes the seductress, Catherine of Aragon, the pious martyr, Catherine Howard, the foolish girl undone by passion. But what did these women feel, think, and strive for when they weren't standing in the glare of royal expectation or public scrutiny? What were their ambitions? How did they navigate a world where their value is tied to fertility, submission, and diplomacy? This exploration is not a retelling of familiar events. It is an excavation of the inner lives so often hidden beneath the pageantry and executioner's acts. To truly understand the lives of Henry VIII's queens, we must view them not as footnotes to a powerful king, but as agents in their own right, navigating a treacherous court with intelligence, courage, and sometimes miscalculation. Their marriages may have defined their public identities, but privately, each woman forged her own path through a maze of shifting alliances, emotional hardship, and impossible expectations. Some shaped policy behind the scenes. Others educated themselves in humanist thought and Protestant theology. Some endured heartbreaking loss. Others seized fleeting moments of power. All left an indelible mark on English history, even if it took centuries for their voices to be fully heard. The aim of this work is to peel back the veil that separates their public images from their private selves. It is an attempt to recover the emotional texture of their lives, to listen for their voices in letters, chronicles, and court records, and to see them not merely as queens, but as women, daughters, wives, mothers, thinkers, believers, and survivors. It is a project of empathy as much as of history, to consider the weight of wearing a crown that could, at any moment, become a shroud. Several key themes emerge when we look beyond the simplistic caricatures. First is the question of agency. Though constrained by their gender and the political structures of the time, each queen found ways to assert control over her circumstances, whether through influence at court, religious expression, or quiet personal resistance. Catherine of Aragon refused to accept her annulment, standing firm as queen until the end. Anne Boleyn helped bring about England's break with Rome, carving a place for herself in one of the most transformative moments in British history. Even the much-maligned Anne of Cleves negotiated her annulment with grace and intelligence, securing a life of wealth and independence. Then there is survival, not just physical survival, which was precarious enough in a court rife with poison, betrayal, and childbed fever, but emotional and spiritual endurance. The constant pressure to produce a male heir, the fear of falling out of royal favor, and the ever-present scrutiny of one's every move created an environment where composure could be a form of armor. Jane Seymour's quiet obedience masked a shrewd understanding of court dynamics. Catherine Parr navigated political danger with poise while publishing religious texts and educating the future Elizabeth I. Motherhood, too, was a defining theme for these women. To be a queen consort was to be a vessel of succession, and yet the emotional toll of pregnancy, miscarriage, and infant mortality remains largely overlooked in traditional narratives. Their hopes and sorrows as mothers, especially in an era where childbirth was fraught with danger, are critical to understanding their resilience and humanity. Catherine of Aragon endured multiple stillbirths with deep personal grief. Anne Boleyn's fierce love for her daughter Elizabeth was matched by her anguish at failing to produce a son. Jane Seymour gave Henry his longed-for heir, only to die days later, her legacy, both triumphant and tragic, encapsulated in that single event. Court intrigue weaves through all their stories like a shadowy thread. The Tudor court was a place of dangerous ambition, where alliances shifted with alarming speed and whispers could cost lives. Each queen was entangled in a web of family pressures, noble rivalries, and political gamesmanship. Navigating these challenges required skill, intuition, and luck. Some, like Catherine Howard, were too young and unprepared to see the traps set before them. Others, like Catherine Parr, used diplomacy and tact to outmaneuver their enemies. In all cases, their stories illustrate the double bind of female power. When wielded too boldly, it threatened the very structures that had elevated them. This work does not claim to know every detail of these women's inner worlds. Many of their personal thoughts are lost to time, filtered through storytellers with political or moral agendas. Yet through close reading, careful context, and the lens of historical empathy, we can begin to imagine the complexity of their experiences. Their letters, the poems written in their courts, the reactions of their contemporaries, all offer glimpses into lives of rich emotional depth and intelligence. We owe them more than the labels history has given them. They were not simply the wives of Henry VIII. They were creators of legacy, holders of fragile power, and women who lived at the epicenter of a dangerous and dazzling world. The stories of Henry VIII's wives endure not just because of their drama, but because they reveal the cost of power in a world that was both spectacularly public and chillingly intimate. Their hidden lives offer lessons not only in the perils of monarchy, but in the endurance of the human spirit under extreme conditions. To uncover these lives is to challenge the simplifications of history and to honor the rich, often painful complexity of the past. In doing so, we begin to understand that their stories were never truly hidden. Catherine of Aragon, the queen who would not yield. Catherine of Aragon's story begins not in England, but in the opulent and devoutly Catholic courts of late 15th century Spain. Born in 1485 to two of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, Catherine was the product of a marriage that unified a fragmented Spain and ushered in the Spanish Renaissance. From a young age, she was raised with an acute awareness of dynastic responsibility, political strategy, and religious devotion. Her mother, Isabella, was a formidable figure, a warrior queen who had personally led armies and championed the Catholic cause. Catherine inherited her mother's intellect, resolve, and faith, along with a sense of personal destiny that would follow her across the sea. The match with Arthur, Prince of Wales, was a strategic alliance between two great Catholic powers, Spain and England, intended to bolster both nations against France. At just 15, Catherine crossed into a foreign land, bringing with her not only the grandeur of her homeland, but also the expectations of a dynasty. Arthur's sudden death within months of their marriage was a devastating blow, both personally and politically. As a teenage widow, she was left in a precarious position, neither fully embraced by the English court nor free to return to Spain. What followed was a 7-year limbo, during which Catherine lived in relative obscurity, often in financial difficulty, while political negotiations determined her fate. Her claim that the marriage to Arthur had not been consummated would later become the linchpin in the most explosive marital dispute in English history. For now, it kept the door open to a new alliance, one with Arthur's younger brother, Henry. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, he married Catherine, then 23, 2 months later. Their marriage was initially characterized by mutual respect and deep affection. Catherine was intelligent, graceful, and politically astute, and Henry was young, charismatic, and idealistic. She played a vital role in legitimizing his rule in the eyes of Europe. As queen, she quickly established herself as more than just a consort. Catherine had been raised with a clear sense of royal duty and diplomacy. Her letters reveal a woman of rare intelligence and composure. Fluent in Latin and knowledgeable in statecraft, she advised Henry on foreign policy and maintained correspondence with European relatives and rulers. Her understanding of European politics, particularly Spanish interests, helped shape England's place on the continental stage during the early years of Henry's reign. Catherine's strength and leadership shone most brightly during Henry's campaign in France in 1513, when she was appointed regent of England. In a remarkable display of capability, she managed domestic affairs, mustered troops, and even rode north in armor to rally defenses against a Scottish invasion. The subsequent English victory at the Battle of Flodden was a resounding success, and Catherine's role in it was recognized both at home and abroad. This was no passive queen. She had demonstrated not just loyalty, but genuine leadership, reinforcing her place in the national imagination as a queen of both heart and steel. But the glories of war and diplomacy were shadowed by Catherine's personal tragedies. Over the course of their marriage, she endured a harrowing series of pregnancies, at least 6, by most accounts, resulting in miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants who died shortly after birth. Only one child, a daughter named Mary, survived to infancy. Each loss was a crushing blow, made more painful by the public nature of her role and the dynastic expectations placed on her. These repeated failures were not only deeply personal, they threatened her very position. In the patriarchal logic of Tudor monarchy, a queen's success was measured by her ability to produce a male heir. Though Henry initially remained loyal and affectionate, his anxiety over succession grew. Catherine's response to these losses was steeped in her devout Catholic faith. She turned increasingly to prayer, fasting, and acts of charity. Her piety was not performative, it was a fundamental part of her identity. Despite her physical and emotional suffering, she maintained dignity and strength. She attended to her duties, upheld her role as queen, and continued to act as a moral and cultural leader at court. Her piety earned her admiration among the English people, many of whom regarded her as a model of queenly virtue. But it also isolated her from Henry, whose growing frustration and eventual infatuation with Anne Boleyn marked the beginning of a bitter and public unraveling. By the late 1520s, Henry had become obsessed with securing a male heir and with the woman he believed could give it to him. His desire to annul his marriage to Catherine, what he termed the Great Matter, became the central political crisis of the decade. Catherine's refusal to accept the annulment was not just personal, it was political, theological, and symbolic. She argued, convincingly, that her marriage to Henry was valid and sacred, and she fought with every tool available to her. She appealed to the Pope. She gave impassioned public speeches. She stood her ground in court, famously kneeling before Henry and declaring that she had been his true and lawful wife. Her unwavering resistance infuriated Henry, but it also galvanized support among those who saw in her a figure of principle and endurance. As Henry moved to sever ties with Rome and declared himself head of the Church of England, Catherine's fate was sealed. She was stripped of her title, forced to live in seclusion, and barred from seeing her daughter marry. Yet she never wavered in her claim to be queen. In exile and poor health, she continued to dress regally and sign letters as Queen of England. Her final years were marked by pain and loss, but also by defiance. She remained steadfast in her faith, loyal to the Catholic Church, and devoted to her daughter's future. When she died in 1536, she left behind a legacy of dignity in the face of relentless adversity. Catherine's influence extended far beyond her royal status. She helped shape court culture through her patronage of learning and her support for female education. She was instrumental in the career of the Spanish humanist Juan Luis Vives, whose treatise on the education of Christian women was commissioned by and dedicated to her. She believed in the intellectual and spiritual capacities of women and encouraged their involvement in religious life and study. Under her guidance, the English court saw a flowering of Renaissance ideas blended with the traditions of Catholic piety. She was not only a queen but a patron of scholars, a mentor to younger women at court, and an intellectual force in her own right. Catherine's story, often overshadowed by the drama of her rivals and successors, deserves to be seen in full. She was not simply the wife Henry cast aside. She was a woman of formidable intelligence, unyielding conviction, and remarkable resilience. Her life stands as a testament to the complexities of power, loyalty, and faith in one of history's most turbulent eras. She did not win in the traditional sense. She lost her crown, her husband, and her status. But in refusing to yield, she left an indelible mark on the monarchy, the church, and the hearts of her people. In many ways, she defined what it meant to be a queen, not just through pageantry or marriage, but through quiet strength, moral clarity, and unwavering purpose. Anne Boleyn, the scandalous queen and political genius. Anne Boleyn's life is one of the most debated, dramatized, and distorted stories in English history. To some, she is the manipulative temptress who broke a kingdom for love and ambition. To others, she is a tragic victim of a treacherous court and an even more treacherous husband. The truth, as with most historical figures of complexity, lies somewhere between myth and reality. Anne was neither saint nor seductress, but a highly intelligent, educated, and politically aware woman who managed to rise to unimaginable power in a male-dominated world. Her story is not just one of scandal and downfall, but of ambition, reform, and ultimately, transformation, both personal and national. Anne's origins were not royal, but they were respectable and well-connected. She was born into the ambitious Boleyn family, whose aspirations were tied to the rising fortunes of England's merchant and noble classes. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat and courtier. Unlike many young English women of her time, Anne was given an exceptional education, largely shaped by her time abroad. As a teenager, she was sent to the Netherlands and later to the court of Margaret of Austria, one of the most sophisticated European courts, before moving to France to serve Queen Claude. In France, Anne was exposed to the Renaissance ideals of wit, refinement, and learning. She also encountered early currents of religious reform, courtly sophistication, and the art of political navigation. By the time she returned to England, she was unlike most English noblewomen, fluent in French, accomplished in music and poetry, and keenly aware of how power operated behind courtly charm. Her return to the English court in the early 1520s marked the beginning of a journey that would change the course of English history. Initially a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Anne quickly distinguished herself not just through her physical appearance, though contemporary accounts note her striking dark eyes and expressive manner, but through her intellect and charisma. She was magnetic, sharp, and self-possessed, and soon caught the attention of King Henry VIII. But unlike many women before her, she did not capitulate to his advances. Anne refused to become his mistress. Whether out of conviction, ambition, or strategic foresight, she chose to wait, not for his affection, but for the crown. Henry's obsession with Anne grew, in part, because of her refusal to be conquered in the usual way. Over the course of their protracted courtship, Anne became not just the object of desire, but a political force. She challenged Catherine's place as queen, the Pope's authority in marital matters, and the entire religious establishment of England. She and Henry exchanged dozens of letters, his often desperate and adoring, hers carefully measured. Throughout this period, Anne cultivated an image of virtue, favoring modesty in dress and a restrained public demeanor, yet she used the tools available to her, fashion, court spectacle, and patronage, to signal her rising status. She embodied a new kind of femininity, intellectual, devout, stylish, and politically engaged. Anne's religious interests deepened during her time in France and continued to evolve in England. She owned copies of banned Protestant texts and supported the translation of the Bible into English. She was not a doctrinaire Lutheran, but her sympathies clearly lay with reform. She encouraged Henry to consider theological arguments that undermined papal supremacy, arguments that would help pave the way for England's break from Rome. Through her influence, reformers like William Tyndale and Thomas Cranmer gained favor. In this way, Anne's role was not passive or symbolic. She actively shaped the ideological foundations of what would become the English Reformation. For all the criticism she received, she was one of the earliest figures to successfully merge court politics with theological change. Her long-awaited marriage to Henry in 1533, after years of political wrangling and the king's dramatic break from the Roman Church, was both a personal triumph and a national crisis. She was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony and shortly afterward gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The king, disappointed that the child was not the longed-for male heir, nonetheless initially maintained his commitment to Anne. But her position was now vastly more precarious. No longer a mysterious and unattainable figure at court, she was subject to all the expectations and scrutiny of a queen consort. Her failure to produce a son and her subsequent miscarriages undermined her claim to divine favor and, in Henry's eyes, her usefulness. Court politics in the Tudor world were brutal and had accumulated numerous enemies. Her assertiveness, her partisanship, and her refusal to conform to the docile ideal of womanhood earned her the ire of conservative courtiers, particularly those still loyal to Catherine and the old religion. The birth of Elizabeth, once seen as the potential heir to a new Protestant dynasty, now seemed like a bitter consolation. Anne's position grew even more precarious when she miscarried a male fetus in 1536, just months before her arrest. This loss was seen by many as a bad omen, divine disfavor on a marriage that had never truly gained popular support. Henry's attentions had already begun to shift to Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting too, and everything she was not: quiet, submissive, and politically unobtrusive. Anne's fall was swift, calculated, and cruel. She was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, charges that most modern historians believe to be entirely fabricated. Her brother, close friends, and court musicians were arrested and executed alongside her. The so-called evidence against her was largely circumstantial or invented. But in a system where the king's word was law, proof was irrelevant. Anne was imprisoned in the Tower of London and, after a sham trial, found guilty. Her final days were marked by composure and a surprising clarity of mind. Those who recorded her last words noted her dignity and poise, even as she faced death. She acknowledged the king as a good and gracious ruler, perhaps a last gesture of grace or self-preservation. On May 19, 1536, she was executed by a French swordsman, her death swift but chilling in its orchestration. She died not just as a fallen queen, but as a woman who had dared to challenge the order of things. In the centuries since her execution, Anne's image has been distorted through plays, films, novels, and polemics. She has been vilified as a homewrecker and lionized as a martyr. But the truth is more nuanced. Anne was not merely the woman who bewitched Henry VIII. She was a product of the Renaissance. Educated, strategic, devout, and daring. She believed in the power of ideas, especially religious reform, and used her influence to advance thinkers, texts, and conversations that would outlive her. She may not have directly authored policies or decrees, but her presence shaped a political environment that allowed the Protestant Reformation to take root in England. Her personal letters, though few survive, show a woman of conviction and depth. One famous letter written during her imprisonment shows not desperation but calm reflection and loyalty to her daughter Elizabeth. Anne's final legacy rests not just in her dramatic life and death, but in that daughter, who would become one of England's greatest monarchs. Elizabeth I inherited not only her mother's keen intelligence and command of courtly performance, but also a sense of destiny shaped by survival and self-reliance. Anne Boleyn's life is often viewed through the lens of her relationship with Henry VIII, but to do so is to overlook her broader significance. She was a queen who challenged convention, reshaped the monarchy, and helped birth a religious and cultural transformation. Her enemies succeeded in ending her life, but they failed to extinguish her influence. The world she helped create, with its new ideas about faith, power, and gender, continued to evolve long after her final breath. Understanding Anne requires stripping away the stereotypes: the seductress, the usurper, the witch. She was none of those things in isolation. She was a human being in an unforgiving world, flawed, ambitious, intelligent, and above all, courageous. Her rise and fall are not simply a cautionary tale. They are a reflection of how power, when held by a woman, is so often misunderstood, feared, and punished. In remembering Anne Boleyn not only for her tragic end but for her visionary role in a moment of seismic change, we come closer to the truth and to the woman behind the legend. Jane Seymour, the quiet strategist. Jane Seymour's life and legacy are often overshadowed by the dramatic fates of her predecessor and successor. Sandwiched between the fiery Anne Boleyn and the tragic Anne of Cleves, Jane is often cast as the quiet, obedient woman who gave Henry VIII his long-desired male heir and died before her character could truly unfold. But this simplification misses the quiet strength and strategic intelligence that defined her role in Tudor history. Jane was not simply a passive figure swept up by fortune. Her rise to queenship and the fulfillment of Henry's dynastic dream were not accidental. Beneath her reserved demeanor was a woman who understood the delicate dance of court life, who navigated power through composure and tact, and who played her part with careful precision. Jane was born around 1508 to Sir John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth, members of the landed gentry with close ties to the aristocracy. The Seymours were a respectable, if not especially influential, family in Tudor England. What they lacked in nobility, they made up for in loyalty to the crown and clever alliances. Jane's upbringing at Wolfhall in Wiltshire was not particularly luxurious, but she was educated in the ways befitting a future gentlewoman. Unlike Anne Boleyn, she was not sent abroad or exposed to the courts of Europe. Her education was more domestic, emphasizing piety, needlework, and obedience. However, this modest foundation would serve her well in a court that had grown weary of controversy and scandal. Jane first appeared at court as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, and later served Anne Boleyn. Her presence in these rival courts exposed her to the complexities of Tudor politics, and she learned through observation how fragile a queen's position could be. While Anne had captivated Henry with wit, intelligence, and allure, Jane presented a stark contrast. She was demure, composed, and seemingly free of political ambition. But this apparent passivity masked a sharp sense of timing and an acute awareness of her surroundings. Jane knew when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to allow others to interpret her silence as virtue. This restraint became her most powerful tool. By 1536, Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was crumbling. Anne had failed to give him a son, and their once passionate relationship had deteriorated into frustration and resentment. Henry's eye turned to Jane at precisely the moment he was seeking both personal solace and political redemption. Jane's gentle manner, combined with her reputation for modesty and moral integrity, presented Henry with an appealing alternative to Anne's assertive and controversial persona. It is unlikely that Jane pursued the king openly, but neither did she refuse his attentions. She understood the gravity of his interest and allowed her family, particularly her ambitious brothers, Edward and Thomas, to position her as a viable and virtuous replacement. What followed was a carefully choreographed transition. Jane did not become Henry's mistress in the manner of previous women. She accepted gifts but refused intimacy. When Henry sent her a purse of gold coins, she famously returned it untouched, accompanied by a letter expressing her wish to remain chaste until marriage. This refusal reinforced her image as a woman of principle and restraint, the very opposite of Anne Boleyn, who was increasingly demonized by her enemies at court. By aligning herself with values that Henry and his advisors now idealized, submissiveness, virtue, and silence, Jane became not just a romantic interest, but a political solution. After Anne's execution in May 1536, Jane married Henry just days later. Her ascent was rapid, yet marked by a quiet dignity. She was crowned queen and quickly set about fulfilling the most urgent task before her, producing a male heir. Jane's pregnancy was met with national celebration. For years, the lack of a legitimate son had plagued Henry's reign, calling into question the stability of the Tudor dynasty. When Jane gave birth to a son, Edward, on October 12, 1537, it was regarded as a divine affirmation of her role as queen. The court erupted in joy, and Jane was praised as the mother of England's future. Henry was overwhelmed with pride and relief, and Jane's place in his heart, and in history, was secured. Yet the triumph was short-lived. Jane fell gravely ill shortly after childbirth, likely from puerperal fever, a common and often deadly postpartum infection. Despite the efforts of physicians and attendants, she died less than 2 weeks after delivering Edward. Her death cast a long shadow over what should have been the greatest moment of her life. She had achieved what neither of Henry's previous wives could. She had given him a legitimate male heir. But in doing so, she paid the ultimate price. Jane's death not only marked a personal tragedy for the king but also served to crystallize her image in the public consciousness. In the wake of her passing, Henry's grief was profound and genuine. Unlike the ends of his previous marriages, one annulled, the other concluded with execution, Jane's death evoked neither scandal nor shame. She was mourned as a virtuous wife and devoted mother. Over time, this grief evolved into myth-making. Jane became the idealized queen in Henry's memory, the pure, gentle woman who had brought him a son and died before she could disappoint or displease him. He ordered her to be buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, and when he died a decade later, he chose to be laid to rest beside her. No other wife received such posthumous honor. This idealization served political as well as emotional purposes. In casting Jane as the true queen, Henry reinforced the legitimacy of Edward's claim to the throne. Jane, who had been alive only briefly as queen, was transformed in public memory into the embodiment of all that a Tudor queen should be. She was not known for challenging authority, not linked to religious or political controversies, and not tarnished by accusations of immorality or betrayal. In many ways, the brevity of her queenship preserved her from the disillusionment that plagued Henry's other marriages. Her silence became a kind of sanctuary for those around her to project their ideals and expectations. Yet beneath this image of docile perfection was a woman who had understood her moment in history and seized it with care. Jane may not have wielded power through open command, but her influence was felt through subtler channels. She used her brief time as queen to advocate for the restoration of Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, to the royal succession. Though she was ultimately unsuccessful during her lifetime, her efforts signaled a willingness to engage in matters of state. She also sought to foster peace at court, encouraging reconciliation between factions and favoring moderation over confrontation. While she did not push reformist agendas like Anne Boleyn or shape international alliances like Catherine of Aragon, Jane contributed to the monarchy's stability at a time when it was deeply fractured. Her brothers would go on to become powerful figures during the reign of Edward VI, a testament to how Jane's short queenship elevated the Seymour family to the center of English politics. Edward Seymour would become Lord Protector during his nephew's minority, wielding enormous influence. Though Jane was not alive to witness this, her marriage and motherhood had irrevocably altered her family's fate. In this sense, her role extended beyond the personal. She was a pivot in Tudor dynastic strategy. In historical memory, Jane Seymour remains something of an enigma. Her quiet manner has led some to overlook her, while others romanticize her as the perfect Tudor queen. The truth is likely more balanced. Jane was neither a saint nor a cipher. She was a woman who understood that in a volatile court, survival and influence did not always come through boldness. Sometimes, power resided in timing, restraint, and the ability to embody what others desired to see. She did not write letters that stirred nations or lead troops into battle. But she provided what the king most desperately wanted, and in doing so, altered the course of English history. Her legacy, therefore, is not just about being the mother of Edward VI. It is about how she navigated the treacherous waters of a court where ambition was dangerous and missteps could be fatal. Jane Seymour managed to ascend, achieve, and endure, if only briefly, by mastering the art of quiet strategy. Her life reminds us that influence can be subtle, that power can take many forms, and that even the quietest voice can echo through centuries. Anne of Cleves, the survivor queen. Anne of Cleves holds a unique and often underappreciated place among Henry VIII's wives. She was not executed or discarded with hostility, nor was she elevated to the status of tragic heroine or romantic martyr. Instead, she managed something far more unusual. She survived, prospered, and outlived all of Henry's other wives, maintaining dignity and influence long after their brief and often brutal fates had been sealed. Her story is one of quiet resilience, cultural misunderstanding, and ultimately, personal reinvention. Anne was born in 1515 into the Duchy of Cleves, a Protestant territory in what is now Western Germany. Her upbringing was provincial by English standards. Unlike Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn, she was not educated in sophisticated European courts. Her training was focused more on domestic skills than on intellectual or political acumen. She could not play musical instruments, speak fluent French or Latin, or engage in the kinds of philosophical discussions prized at Henry's court. But she was well-mannered, obedient, and grounded in the Lutheran values of modesty, virtue, and household management. These qualities were valued in her homeland and were seen as appropriate for a noblewoman preparing for marriage. What she lacked in polish, she made up for in sincerity and practicality. Anne's entrance into Henry's marital saga was largely orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister. Following the death of Jane Seymour and a few years of mourning, Henry once again sought a wife, not only for companionship and the hope of more heirs, but also for diplomatic advantage. With England increasingly isolated due to its break with Rome, Cromwell proposed an alliance with the Protestant states of Germany. The Duchy of Cleves, under the leadership of Anne's brother, was a promising partner in the complex web of European politics. A marriage treaty with Anne was pursued to solidify this alliance. Before agreeing to the match, Henry requested a portrait of and to be painted by Hans Holbein the Younger, the king's favorite artist. Holbein's rendering of Anne was flattering and tactful, designed to emphasize her best features. Henry was reportedly pleased with the image and agreed to the marriage without meeting her in person. This decision would prove to be a critical misstep. When Anne arrived in England in late 1539, Henry arranged a surprise encounter in disguise, an old chivalric custom he believed would kindle romantic sparks. But Anne, unfamiliar with such traditions, failed to respond with expected enthusiasm. Instead of being flattered by the theatrics, she was confused and restrained. Henry, deeply disappointed by the reality of her appearance and demeanor, reportedly referred to her as a Flanders mare, a cruel and often repeated insult that has unfairly colored her reputation ever since. What Henry saw as a lack of beauty or charm was, in truth, a cultural misunderstanding. Anne, who had been raised in a strict Lutheran household with little exposure to English courtly behaviors, did not fit the ideal of femininity that Henry had come to expect. She spoke little English, was not trained in flirtation or music, and had no experience in managing the subtle but demanding social rituals of the Tudor court. But while Henry found her unappealing, his courtiers generally observed that Anne was kind, well-intentioned, and carried herself with grace. The marriage was solemnized in January 1540, but from the start, it was clear Henry had little desire for his new queen. He quickly sought an annulment, citing non-consummation and Anne's pre-contract with another European noble as legal grounds. What could have spiraled into scandal or personal ruin instead became one of Anne's greatest triumphs. She agreed to the annulment with remarkable composure and political wisdom. Rather than protest or resist, she cooperated fully, expressing respect for Henry and his wishes. In doing so, she protected her reputation and ensured her continued safety and comfort in England. Anne's decision not to contest the annulment, despite the humiliation it might have caused, demonstrated keen self-preservation and diplomatic skill. She negotiated generous terms for herself, receiving a substantial income, properties including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, the former Boleyn family estate, and the honorary title of the King's Sister. This title, though technically devoid of political power, afforded her a unique status at court. She remained a respected figure in royal circles and was invited to court events, often given precedence over other noblewomen. Her ability to remain in Henry's good graces after such a personal rejection speaks volumes about her tact and adaptability. In the years following the annulment, Anne lived a life of quiet independence. She never remarried, either by choice or by necessity, but remained close enough to the royal family to retain influence. Her presence was a reminder that a queen could survive disgrace not by fighting, but by yielding wisely. She developed friendships with Henry's daughters, particularly Mary, with whom she shared religious sympathies. Though she maintained her Lutheran faith, she was never seen as a threat to the crown's religious policies and managed to navigate the treacherous shifts in doctrinal authority without drawing suspicion. Anne's popularity with the English people also endured. She was viewed with a mixture of sympathy and admiration for the grace with which she handled her failed marriage. Her generosity, modesty, and apparent contentment with her life after Henry contributed to a positive public image. In many ways, her story resonated as a quiet vindication of virtue and common sense in a world often dominated by ruthlessness and ambition. Though her role in English history is often dismissed as minor or transitional, Anne's story illustrates the importance of agency, even within constrained circumstances. She turned what might have been a devastating rejection into an opportunity for stability and respect. She managed to avoid the political intrigues that had ensnared Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, and unlike Catherine of Aragon, she did not become a symbol of defiance. Her survival was not just a matter of fortune. It was the result of careful navigation and emotional intelligence. As Henry moved on to marry his fifth and sixth wives and continued to maintain her place in court society, her status remained secure and her lifestyle was comfortable. She was a landowner, a patron, and a figure of enduring goodwill. Even after Henry's death in 1547, Anne lived quietly in England, avoiding entanglements in the power struggles that followed. She died in 1557 at the age of 41 and was buried in Westminster Abbey, an unusual honor for a former queen who had never been crowned or celebrated during her reign. In retrospect, Anne of Cleves' life serves as a powerful counter-narrative to the familiar tales of Henry's wives as victims of violence or pawns of ambition. She was neither a tragic heroine nor a scandalous figure. She was a survivor. Her story reminds us that strength can take many forms, dignity, compromise, and endurance among them. While she may not have left behind dramatic speeches, reformist manifestos, or legendary love letters, she left a legacy of wisdom in restraint and triumph in survival. In the turbulent theater of Tudor court life, that may have been the most remarkable achievement of all. Catherine Howard, the tragedy of youth. Catherine Howard's life was brief, turbulent, and ultimately tragic, shaped by the complexities of Tudor court politics, the expectations placed on women, and the stark contrast between innocence and experience in a world that gave her little of either. Her story is not just one of scandal and downfall, but of a young woman caught in a system that demanded perfection while offering no protection. Executed at around 17 years old, Catherine remains one of the most heartbreaking figures in the saga of Henry VIII's six wives, not only because of her youth, but because of how clearly her fate was sealed by the forces around her. Born around 1521 or 1522, Catherine came from the noble but financially struggling Howard family, a branch of one of the most powerful houses in England. Her father, Lord Edmund Howard, was the younger son of the Duke of Norfolk, and though he held noble lineage, his personal standing and finances were weak. Catherine's mother died early in her life, and her father's relative obscurity meant she was not brought up in the main Howard household, but instead was sent to live with her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Agnes Tilney. The Duchess's home served as a kind of informal boarding school for noble girls, but it lacked the discipline, structure, and moral oversight expected of an aristocratic upbringing. Catherine's education was minimal compared to that of other queens like Anne Boleyn or Catherine of Aragon. She was not instructed in Latin, classical literature, or theology. Instead, her upbringing emphasized charm, music, dancing, and household skills, traits considered desirable in a noblewoman, but not ones that prepared her for the political and moral scrutiny of the court. Her step-grandmother's household was notoriously lax. The dormitory where the girls slept was poorly supervised, and romantic or sexual liaisons were not uncommon. It was here that Catherine became involved in inappropriate relationships while still in her early teens, most notably with her music tutor, Henry Mannix, and later with Francis Dereham, a man who would later claim they had been informally betrothed. These early encounters, while frowned upon by later moralists, must be seen within the context of her age and vulnerability. Catherine was a teenager in a chaotic environment, surrounded by older men and little adult supervision. The relationships were not necessarily ones of full consent as we would define it today. Her sense of love, loyalty, and consequence was shaped in an environment where power dynamics and sexual attention were poorly regulated and deeply exploitative. Catherine's life changed dramatically in 1540 when she was brought to court to serve as a lady-in-waiting to and of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife. It was not long before she caught the king's eye. Henry, nearing 50 and increasingly infirm, was enchanted by Catherine's youthful beauty and energy. To him, she must have seemed like a radiant promise of renewal, charming, playful, flirtatious, and full of life. Their courtship progressed rapidly, and within weeks of annulling his marriage to Anne, Henry married Catherine. She was likely no older than 16. As queen, Catherine enjoyed all the trappings of her elevated position. She was showered with jewels, fine dresses, and lavish accommodations. Her presence at court brought a renewed sense of festivity and romance, and she became a symbol of Henry's continued virility and power. But this extravagant role came with expectations far beyond her experience. The court was a place of surveillance, jealousy, and manipulation. Every move was watched, and every association could become ammunition in political games. Catherine's charm, while captivating, did not equip her with the knowledge or caution needed to navigate the perilous waters of royal life. Her behavior as queen remained within expected bounds for a time, but her past, and possibly her continuing connections to it, would come back to haunt her. Among her staff was Francis Dereham, the man with whom she had a past relationship. His presence at court raised eyebrows and suspicions, and Catherine, perhaps out of misplaced loyalty or fear, brought him into her household. Complicating matters further were rumors that she had taken another lover, Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. Whether this relationship was romantic, sexual, or emotional remains debated, but the accusations alone were enough to trigger catastrophe. Once these suspicions reached the king's ears, Henry's reaction was one of devastation and rage. His pride, trust, and masculine identity were deeply wounded. Investigations began swiftly, interrogations were conducted with ferocity, and evidence was pieced together through confessions, some of them likely obtained under threat or pressure. Catherine was arrested and held at Sion Abbey, where she reportedly fell into a state of shock and despair. When informed of her death sentence, she was said to have screamed and wept uncontrollably. Her execution in February 1542 was carried out with grim efficiency. She was beheaded at the Tower of London, the same fate suffered by her cousin Anne Boleyn. According to some accounts, on the night before her execution, Catherine practiced laying her head on the block, seeking to master the only control she had left over her fate. Whether or not this story is apocryphal, it reflects the poignancy and helplessness of her final days. Her body was buried near Anne's in the Tower Chapel, two young women whose beauty and ambition were destroyed by the very institution that had elevated them. Catherine Howard's downfall is often cast as the result of personal folly or moral failure, but such interpretations fail to acknowledge the broader injustices she endured. She was a teenager in a predatory environment, raised without the protection or education needed to understand the implications of her actions. She was thrust into a marriage with a man over 30 years her senior, whose interest in her was more about his own power and image than her welfare. She was surrounded by courtiers who used her as a pawn, manipulating her for their own gain or shielding their secrets through her. In many ways, Catherine was a victim not just of individual misjudgment, but of an entire system that treated women as tools of dynastic and political strategy. Her youth, her lack of experience, and her exposure to court politics made her incredibly vulnerable. Her story stands as a stark contrast to the more politically seasoned queens who came before and after her. While Anne Boleyn and Catherine Parr wielded influence through intellect and maneuvering, Catherine Howard was swept up in forces beyond her comprehension or control. The injustice of her execution lies not simply in the severity of her punishment, but in how little regard was given to the conditions that shaped her. In another time and place, Catherine might have lived a quiet life as a nobleman's wife, remembered for her grace and charm rather than her supposed crimes. But in Henry VIII's court, where appearances meant everything and mercy was in short supply, her youth became a liability rather than a shield. Her beauty, once her greatest asset, became the very thing that drew her into a perilous spotlight from which there was no escape. Today, Catherine Howard is increasingly seen through the lens of compassion and context. Historians have revisited her life not as the story of a reckless girl who brought about her own ruin, but as that of a teenager ensnared by a brutal system of gender and power. She has come to symbolize the many young women, both in history and beyond, who are denied the opportunity to grow, to learn, to recover from mistakes, or even to define their own stories. Her brief life, marked by both dazzling elevation and catastrophic fall, offers a haunting reminder of the dangers of romanticizing youth, of overlooking the vulnerabilities of inexperience, and of failing to question the structures that demand perfection while punishing any deviation from it. In Catherine Howard's story, we see not just a tragic queen, but a young woman who never truly had the chance to become herself. Catherine Parr, the scholar and the stepmother. Catherine Parr's life was one of intellect, composure, and quiet resilience. Among Henry VIII's 6 wives, she was the last and arguably the most multifaceted, neither a young romantic swept up in courtly ambition, nor a foreign princess sent to secure an alliance, but a mature, widowed noblewoman with her own convictions, intellect, and steady hand. Her journey through the Tudor court and beyond speaks to the complexity of womanhood in a perilous age, and to the capacity for strength not in defiance, but in measured survival and moral clarity. Born in 1512 into a noble family closely connected to the royal court, Catherine Parr was well-positioned from birth. Her father, Sir Thomas Parr, was a knight and courtier with ties to the Yorkist nobility, and her mother, Maud Green, served as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. Catherine grew up in an environment steeped in both privilege and education, where courtly grace and intellectual engagement were encouraged. She spoke multiple languages, including Latin and French, and developed an early affinity for learning that would define her adult life. Catherine's early adulthood was marked by traditional noble obligations. She married young, first to Edward Berg, and after his death, to John Neville, Lord Latimer. These marriages were not especially romantic, but they were socially advantageous. By the time she came to Henry's attention, Catherine had already been widowed twice and had gained not only social standing but political and household experience. Her second marriage, in particular, placed her in the midst of northern unrest, and she proved herself to be a capable manager of both estates and difficult political tensions. These early chapters of her life tempered her resolve, sharpened her diplomatic skills, and helped her survive what would become the most dangerous role in the kingdom, queen consort to Henry VIII. When she entered Henry's court as a widow, she was not seeking elevation. In fact, Catherine was in love with another man, Thomas Seymour, the dashing and ambitious brother of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour. But when the aging and ailing king expressed his interest in her, it was not something she could refuse. She accepted his proposal in 1543 and became his sixth wife, stepping into a role haunted by the memories of her predecessors, some adored, some discarded, some executed. Unlike her more youthful counterparts, Catherine was 30 years old, intelligent, pragmatic, and aware of the dangers that came with wearing the crown. Catherine quickly proved herself to be more than just a caretaker to a declining king. She took on the responsibilities of queen consort with seriousness and dedication. Most notably, she brought a unifying influence to Henry's fractured family. The king's relationships with his children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, had been strained by religious upheaval and marital discord. Catherine, through genuine affection and political savvy, helped repair those bonds. She treated Henry's children as her own, fostering their education and encouraging familial unity. Elizabeth, in particular, developed a deep respect for Catherine and later credited her with nurturing her intellectual development. Catherine's own religious beliefs were grounded in the Protestant Reform movement. She read the works of reformers, engaged in theological discussion, and supported the translation of the Bible into English. However, she walked a delicate line, for the king's religious stance remained mercurial, shifting between conservative Catholic practices and Protestant reforms depending on political expedience. Catherine's religious convictions put her at risk more than once, particularly when conservative factions at court sought to undermine her influence by accusing her of heresy. One such moment nearly cost her everything. In 1546, a warrant for her arrest was drawn up after she engaged Henry in theological debate. Her enemies at court, particularly Bishop Gardiner, hoped to use her reformist leanings as justification for removing her. But Catherine, understanding the stakes, quickly changed course. She presented herself to Henry not as a teacher, but as a humble student, flattering him by saying she only debated theology to learn from his wisdom. Whether Henry ever truly believed this is unclear, but he accepted her explanation and allowed her to return to his side. Her survival in this moment illustrates the astuteness of her political instincts. She recognized when to speak and, more importantly, when to be silent. Catherine's life as queen was not consumed solely by court politics or religious caution. She also fostered a vibrant intellectual environment, both for herself and for the people around her. She collected books, engaged in correspondence with scholars, and was deeply involved in writing. In 1545, she published Psalms or Prayers, a devotional text adapted from Latin into English. This made her the first Queen of England to publish a book under her own name. Her writing reflected her deep religious convictions, personal humility, and scholarly curiosity, and it provided a model of female piety and intellect during a time when women were still widely excluded from theological discourse. When Henry died in January 1547, Catherine might have retreated from public life, secure in her widowhood and financial stability. But she chose another path. Free to marry as she pleased, she reunited with Thomas Seymour, her former love. Their marriage, conducted in secret, was romantic but ill-fated. Seymour, now uncle to the young King Edward VI and eager for political influence, was ambitious and reckless. Catherine's decision to marry him so soon after Henry's death sparked gossip and disapproval at court. Nonetheless, the couple settled into a new life together, and Catherine soon became pregnant for the first time. This final chapter of her life, though short, was filled with promise and complexity. Catherine, after years of widowhood and courtly obligation, was finally able to pursue personal happiness. She moved to Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire and prepared for the birth of her child with hope and excitement. But tragedy struck quickly. In September 1548, she gave birth to a daughter, Mary, and within days, Catherine fell gravely ill with puerperal fever. She died shortly after, likely from a bacterial infection that was common and often fatal in an age before antibiotics. Catherine's death was a quiet end to a life of remarkable substance. She was buried at Sudeley Castle, the only one of Henry's queens to receive such an honor outside London, and the only one with a surviving original tomb. Her daughter did not live to adulthood, and Thomas Seymour's reckless ambition would lead to his downfall and execution less than a year later. But Catherine's legacy was not defined by romance or scandal. It was preserved through her writings, her influence on Henry's children, and her role in the religious transformations of the time. She remains one of the most intellectually vibrant and politically skilled women of the Tudor age. Her support for education, particularly the education of women, foreshadowed some of the advancements that would come under Elizabeth I. Her writings were deeply personal and spiritually introspective, revealing a woman who sought to live with both humility and integrity in a world that rarely rewarded either. Unlike the dramatic falls of Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr's story was one of persistence. She survived the court, guided its future monarchs, and contributed to the religious and literary life of the kingdom. In many ways, Catherine was the least controversial of Henry's wives in the public imagination, yet perhaps the most quietly revolutionary. Her ability to blend submission with substance and personal conviction with political caution allowed her to leave a mark not through confrontation, but through continuity and compassion. She was a reformer who chose diplomacy over protest, a writer who chose clarity over polemic, and a stepmother who offered love and structure to a broken royal family. Catherine Parr's life serves as a counterpoint to the more dramatic fates of the women who came before her. She represents the possibility of navigating power with grace, and of surviving not by compromising one's values, but by living them carefully, consciously, and with enduring dignity. In an age that demanded silence from women, she found a way to speak, and in doing so, made sure she would be remembered not just as Henry's last wife, but as a voice, a mind, and a mother of England's future. The lives of the women who served Henry VIII's queens, maids of honor, ladies-in-waiting, and confidants, offer a fascinating glimpse into the hidden world of Tudor court life. These women, often overlooked in traditional histories that focus on monarchs and nobles, formed an essential part of the royal household. They were not only attendants and companions, but also key players in the intricate social and political networks that shaped the fate of the queens and the court itself. Their stories reveal the complexity of loyalty, the subtle power of emotional support, and the dangerous intrigues that simmered behind. Serving as a maid of honor or a lady-in-waiting was both a privilege and a precarious position. These women were usually drawn from noble or gentry families, sent to court as part of their upbringing and education. For young noblewomen, entering the queen's household was a significant opportunity. It was a chance to learn courtly manners, receive a formal education in etiquette, music, and languages, and make connections that could advance their family's status. Yet, this role also exposed them to the hazards of court life, where favor could be fleeting and alliances shifted quickly. The daily lives of these women were demanding and structured. They attended to the queen's personal needs, accompanied her to religious services, dances, and social events, and participated in the rituals of court life. Their presence helped to define the queen's public image. Her grace, virtue, and dignity were often expressed through the behavior and appearance of her attendants. But beyond their duties, these women provided vital emotional support. The queen's position could be isolating, with constant scrutiny from the king, courtiers, and rival factions. Ladies-in-waiting often formed close bonds, sharing confidences, fears, and hopes. These relationships created a network of loyalty and solidarity that was crucial for the queen's psychological well-being. Yet the emotional bonds were frequently tested by the treacherous politics of the Tudor court. Women in the queen's household could be both protectors and betrayers. The pressure to maintain favor with the king and powerful courtiers sometimes led maids and ladies to act as spies or informants. Letters and secret communications were common tools in this shadowy game. These writings, often veiled in coded language or poetic metaphor, could carry intelligence or warnings, but also gossip and slander. The court was rife with suspicion, and a misplaced word or a revealing letter could spell ruin. Some of the most influential women in the queen's inner circles were those who managed to navigate these dangers with skill and discretion. They acted as intermediaries between the queen and the king or other courtiers, influencing decisions and smoothing conflicts. Their ability to read court politics, anticipate shifts in power, and maintain trust on all sides was essential. This subtle diplomacy required intelligence, tact, and an acute awareness of the stakes involved. In many cases, these women shaped events from behind the scenes, their influence felt but rarely acknowledged. The maids and ladies also played a crucial role in the transmission of culture and education. They were often well-educated themselves and could support the queen's interests in literature, religion, and the arts. Through their conversations, letters, and patronage, they contributed to the intellectual life of the court. Some women went on to become notable patrons or writers in their own right, helping to spread reformist ideas or support emerging artists. Their presence helped to create an environment in which the queens could assert their own intellectual and cultural authority. Loyalty was a central theme in the lives of these women. Their allegiance was primarily to the queen, but it was also tested by competing demands to their families, to the king, and to factions within the court. The shifting fortunes of the queens, annulments, executions, and political upheavals meant that loyalty could become a dangerous gamble. Some women remained steadfast through scandal and downfall, offering comfort and counsel when it was most needed. Others chose self-preservation, withdrawing or switching allegiances to protect themselves and their families. The emotional labor performed by the queen's attendants was often invisible in official records, but it was indispensable. They absorbed the queen's anxieties, offered companionship during times of isolation, and acted as sounding boards for her thoughts and feelings. This support helped queens maintain their composure under pressure and navigate the emotional toll of court life. The presence of trusted women who could be confided in created a semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos of political intrigue and personal danger. At times, these women found themselves caught in the crossfire of court conflicts. Accusations of disloyalty, moral impropriety, or involvement in conspiracies could lead to their dismissal, imprisonment, or worse. The downfall of a queen often meant the scattering or punishment of her household, as new factions purged supporters and replaced them with loyalists. The maids' and ladies' fortunes rose and fell with the queen's, their lives entwined with the turbulent tides of Tudor politics. Despite the risks, many women embraced their roles with a sense of duty and ambition. Serving in the queen's household offered a path to influence and visibility rare for women in the 16th century. Through careful navigation of court life, some were able to secure advantageous marriages, titles, or pensions. Their stories highlight the agency women could exercise even within a patriarchal system, using charm, intelligence, and alliances to shape their destinies. In sum, the maids of honor, ladies-in-waiting, and confidantes formed the emotional and political backbone of the queen's courts. They were educators, companions, diplomats, and sometimes spies, whose lives were woven into the fabric of Tudor history. Their experiences illuminate the private struggles behind public spectacle, revealing the human complexity that underpinned one of England's most dramatic and dangerous eras. Their stories, though often untold, remind us that the power of women in history is not only found in crowns and battles, but also in the quiet, loyal work of those who stand behind the throne. The lives of Henry VIII's wives were deeply marked by the expectations and realities of motherhood, an experience filled with hope, grief, and immense pressure. The role of queen was inseparable from the duty to produce an heir, especially a male heir, to secure the Tudor dynasty. This expectation shaped their lives and legacies in profound ways, influencing their status at court, their personal relationships, and even their survival. Yet, behind the grand political stakes lay a deeply personal and often painful journey of childbearing, marked by miscarriages, stillbirths, and the overwhelming weight of loss. For many of Henry's wives, the birth of children was the defining event of their queenship. Producing a son was not simply a matter of family happiness, but a political necessity. England's future stability was thought to hinge on the arrival of a male heir who could inherit the throne without dispute. This placed an extraordinary physical and psychological burden on the queens. They were expected to conceive quickly and successfully, with failure often interpreted as a sign of personal or divine disfavor. Their bodies became battlegrounds for dynastic ambitions, and their reproductive health was closely scrutinized by courtiers, physicians, and the king himself. The reality of childbirth in the 16th century was harsh and often tragic. Medical knowledge was limited, and maternal and infant mortality rates were high. Many of Henry's wives endured multiple pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. These losses were not only physically devastating but carried immense social consequences. A queen who failed to produce a living heir risked losing favor, power, and ultimately her position. The grief was compounded by the public nature of their suffering. Private pain was witnessed and judged by the entire court and nation. One of the most poignant examples of these pressures is found in the life of Catherine of Aragon. She bore Henry's first surviving child, Mary, but endured several miscarriages and stillbirths afterward. These losses deeply affected her both physically and emotionally. The repeated failures to produce a male heir were used by Henry and his advisors to question her ability and legitimacy, fueling the king's eventual decision to seek an annulment. Catherine's steadfast faith and dignity throughout her suffering made her a figure of sympathy and resilience, but the toll of childbearing, and its loss, was undeniable. Anne Boleyn's experience highlights another dimension of this struggle. Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, the future queen who would become one of England's greatest monarchs. However, Anne's inability to provide a male heir was a source of great tension. She suffered at least 2 miscarriages, and the pressure to produce a son was relentless. The birth of Elizabeth was initially met with disappointment by Henry, who continued to hope for a male successor. Anne's political enemies exploited this situation, portraying her as cursed or incapable, which contributed to her downfall and execution. Elizabeth's relationship with her mother's legacy is a complex blend of personal identity and political symbolism. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn, she inherited a contentious claim to the throne. For much of her early life, Elizabeth's legitimacy was questioned, and she faced the stigma attached to her mother's execution. Yet, as queen, Elizabeth embraced her mother's memory in ways that shaped her own reign. She positioned herself as the rightful heir of the Tudor line, a symbol of Protestant England and stability after decades of religious and dynastic upheaval. Elizabeth's policies and self-presentation often echoed Anne's reformist spirit, and she worked tirelessly to solidify her legitimacy, transforming her mother's troubled legacy into a source of strength. The psychological impact of childbearing pressures extended beyond the queens to the broader court and society. The intense focus on fertility and lineage placed women in a precarious position, where their value was often reduced to their reproductive capabilities. The trauma of miscarriages and stillbirths was rarely publicly acknowledged, yet it left lasting scars. Contemporary accounts reveal that queens suffered bouts of depression, anxiety, and physical illness connected to the stress of pregnancy and loss. Their emotional resilience was continually tested by the demands of producing an heir under the harshest of conditions. Moreover, the political consequences of these reproductive struggles could be devastating. A queen's failure to produce a male heir was frequently used as justification for annulment, imprisonment, or execution. The link between motherhood and power was brutally direct. Without an heir, a queen's position was vulnerable. This created an environment where women were both revered and reviled, celebrated for their ability to bear children but also blamed for their inability. The childbearing journey was fraught with uncertainty and peril, shaping the queen's fates in ways that extended far beyond their personal lives. Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, briefly fulfilled the ideal role of a Tudor queen by giving birth to a healthy male heir, Edward VI. This achievement elevated Jane's status and secured her place in history as the mother of the much-desired son. However, her triumph was short-lived, as she died shortly after childbirth. Her death cast a shadow over the joy of Edward's birth and underscored the deadly risks of childbirth in the era. Jane's legacy was entwined with the hopes of a new Tudor dynasty, but it was also a reminder of the fragile nature of life and succession. The stories of the other queens further illustrate the emotional and physical toll of motherhood under royal scrutiny. Anne of Cleves, though married to Henry for a short and politically motivated union, did not have children with the king, and this lack of offspring contributed to the marriage's annulment. Catherine Howard's youth and lack of experience intersected tragically with the demands of queenship. She was too young to bear children and was executed before childbirth could even be considered. Catherine Parr, the last queen, never bore Henry's child but became a stepmother to his surviving children, nurturing and educating them in ways that shaped England's future. The intense pressure to produce heirs also influenced the Queen's relationships with one another and with Henry. Rivalries could be fueled by jealousy, fear, or ambition, as each queen's reproductive success or failure had implications for her rival's survival. Henry's own expectations and impatience often heightened these tensions, and his shifting affections reflected the successes and failures of his wives in fulfilling the dynastic mission. The succession question loomed large over every aspect of court life, affecting alliances, political maneuvering, and even religious policy. Beyond the political dimension, the Queen's experiences with childbirth and motherhood were deeply human. Their hopes for children were infused with personal longing and joy, as well as fear and grief. Letters, diaries, and contemporary accounts reveal moments of tenderness, despair, and resilience. These women navigated the physical pain and emotional upheaval of pregnancy in a world with limited medical care and little understanding of mental health. Their capacity to endure these hardships while maintaining public roles of dignity and authority speaks to their strength and complexity. In examining the Queen's lives through the lens of motherhood, it becomes clear that childbearing was both a source of power and vulnerability. It was the means by which queens could secure their place in history and influence the course of the nation, yet it was also a perilous journey marked by loss and uncertainty. The legacy of Henry VIII's wives is inseparable from their roles as mothers, whether successful or tragic, and their stories offer a profound insight into the intersection of gender, power, and family in Tudor England. Ultimately, the Queen's experiences with children, heirs, and loss underscore the human cost behind the grand narratives of monarchy and succession. Their personal struggles with fertility and motherhood shaped not only their own destinies, but also the political and religious transformations of their time. The emotional landscape of childbearing pressures reveals the hidden lives behind the throne, lives filled with love, sorrow, resilience, and an enduring quest for legacy. The religious landscape of Tudor England was one of profound transformation, upheaval, and conflict, deeply influencing the personal and political lives of Henry VIII's wives. Each queen's faith and religious stance intersected with the volatile currents of reform and resistance that defined the era, shaping their identities, alliances, and ultimately their fates. This period was marked by a collision between long-standing Catholic traditions and the emerging Protestant ideas that challenged the very foundations of English spirituality and governance. Catherine of Aragon, the first of Henry's queens, embodied steadfast Catholic devotion. Raised in the intensely Catholic court of Spain under Isabella of Castile, her faith was integral to her identity. Catherine's religious commitment was more than personal piety. It was a political statement in a time when the unity of church and state was unquestioned. Her adherence to Catholic doctrine framed her resistance to Henry's efforts to annul their marriage, which was rooted in his desire for a male heir and his subsequent break with Rome. Catherine's refusal to accept the annulment was grounded in both theological conviction and a fierce sense of her own legitimacy as queen. She became a symbol of Catholic resistance in England, embodying the old faith even as Henry advanced reforms that would sever ties with the papacy. Anne Boleyn's religious sympathies marked a departure from the old order. She was associated with early Protestant ideas and reformist circles that questioned the authority of the Catholic Church. Anne's intellectual curiosity and exposure to continental reformers influenced her support for religious change. Her marriage to Henry coincided with the English Reformation's beginning, as the king sought to consolidate religious authority under his control. Anne used her position at court to promote reformist scholars and encourage theological debate. Her faith was intertwined with political ambition. She represented a new vision for England, one that aligned with emerging Protestant ideals and the monarch's desire for supremacy over the church. The religious convictions of Henry's wives reveal the broader tensions of the period between tradition and innovation, orthodoxy and dissent. These tensions played out not only in public arenas, but also in the intimate spaces of the royal household. The queens were often caught between competing religious factions, each vying for influence at court. Their personal beliefs influenced their relationships with Henry, their roles as mothers, and their ability to navigate court politics. The religious affiliations they embodied were closely linked to their political fortunes and survival. Later queens such as Catherine Parr exemplified the growing prominence of Protestantism in England. Parr was an educated and intellectual woman who openly engaged with reformist ideas. She authored religious texts advocating for the English Bible's accessibility and supported Protestant clergy. Her religious writing reflected the shifting theological landscape and the increasing tolerance, at least temporarily, for reformist ideas under Henry's later reign. Catherine Parr's faith was both a personal conviction and a political tool, helping her maintain favor with the king while promoting the intellectual and religious currents that would shape England's future. The spectrum of faith among Henry's wives, from Catherine of Aragon's Catholic devotion to Catherine Parr's Protestant activism, mirrors the broader religious upheaval of Tudor England. Their experiences highlight how personal belief and political necessity were often inseparable in the royal context. Faith was a source of strength and resistance, but also a cause of conflict and downfall. The Queen's religious lives reveal the deep complexities of navigating identity, power, and survival amid the Reformation's turbulent currents. Beyond their lifetimes, the legacy of Henry VIII's 6 queens has been shaped by how history, culture, and popular imagination have remembered and interpreted their stories. Each queen's image has undergone a process of romanticization, demonization, and revision, reflecting changing societal values and historical perspectives. The afterlives of these women are as much a part of their story as their lived experiences, influencing how modern audiences understand Tudor England. From early chronicles to contemporary media, the queens have been portrayed through a variety of lenses. Catherine of Aragon has often been depicted as the wronged and devout queen, a tragic figure embodying loyalty and dignity in the face of personal and political betrayal. Anne Boleyn, alternatively, has been cast in opposing roles as a scheming temptress or a martyr for religious reform. These conflicting portrayals illustrate the complexities of her character and the contentious nature of her legacy. Popular culture has played a significant role in shaping these images. Television series such as The Tudors have brought the queens to life for modern audiences, blending historical fact with dramatic interpretation. Novels and musicals like Wolf Hall and Six offer fresh perspectives, sometimes emphasizing feminist viewpoints or exploring the queen's voices and experiences more deeply. These works have contributed to a broader reassessment of the queens, challenging traditional narratives and highlighting their agency, intellect, and humanity. Historiographical shifts over the past century have further transformed understandings of Henry's wives. Earlier histories often focused on their relationships with the king and their roles as pawns in male-dominated politics. More recent feminist interpretations have emphasized their strength, resilience, and influence. Scholars have explored the queens as complex individuals navigating a patriarchal system, using the limited power available to them to assert their own identities and protect their interests. Modern scholarship also recognizes the queen's contributions to religious, cultural, and political life, moving beyond reductive stereotypes. This nuanced approach acknowledges the intersection of gender, power, and faith in their lives, situating them within the broader context of Tudor society's transformations. The Queen's stories are increasingly seen as integral to understanding the era's historical and social dynamics. The religious faith of Henry VIII's wives was deeply entwined with the political and cultural shifts of Tudor England, reflecting broader currents of reform and resistance. Their personal beliefs shaped their roles at court and influenced the course of English history. Equally important is the way these women have been remembered and reinterpreted over time, from early chronicles to contemporary media and scholarship. Their legacies continue to evolve, revealing the enduring fascination and complexity of their lives and times. Through faith and memory, the hidden lives of Henry VIII's wives remain a vital part of the story of England's past. The 6 wives of Henry VIII have long been remembered primarily for their relationships with the king, their marriages, and the dramatic events that unfolded around them. Yet, to understand these women solely as wives does great injustice to their individuality, political influence, and emotional complexity. Each queen was a distinct figure navigating one of the most turbulent and transformative periods in English history, and their lives reveal much more than the roles assigned to them by marriage or exploring their stories reveals the nuances of power, gender dynamics, and legacy in Tudor England, and challenges us to see them as fully realized people who shaped, and were shaped by, the world around them. Far from being mere appendages to Henry VIII, these women possessed agency, intellect, and resilience. They were political actors in their own right, operating within a system that often constrained women, but could not entirely silence them. Their influence extended beyond their marriages to Henry. They were patrons of the arts and education, players in diplomatic negotiations, and even figures of religious reform or resistance. They shaped court culture and, through their children and legacies, impacted the future direction of England. To reduce them to just wives is to ignore the breadth of their experiences and contributions. Their individuality is evident in their contrasting personalities and ambitions. Catherine of Aragon was a deeply religious and dignified queen who wielded considerable influence as regent and diplomat, standing firm in her convictions even when faced with personal and political ruin. Anne Boleyn, charismatic and politically astute, was a catalyst for England's religious transformation and left a legacy that would resonate for centuries through her daughter Elizabeth. Jane Seymour, often portrayed as quiet and submissive, was a strategic figure who secured the Tudor line through her son Edward VI. Anne of Cleves survived the volatility of Henry's court with remarkable grace and negotiation skills, turning what might have been a disastrous union into a comfortable, respected role. Catherine Howard's youthful tragedy reveals the perilous intersection of gender, power, and vulnerability. Catherine Parr's intellectualism and reformist zeal highlight the possibilities for female influence even in a male-dominated world. Each woman brought her own strength, complexity, and challenges to the role of queen. Their stories also illuminate the broader dynamics of power and gender in Tudor England. The queen's lives were shaped by the patriarchal structures of their time, where a woman's value was often linked to her ability to bear heirs and serve the king's interests. Yet, within these constraints, they found ways to assert themselves and influence the realm. Their navigation of court politics required political savvy, emotional resilience, and sometimes sheer courage. The pressures they faced, ranging from public scrutiny to personal danger, exposed the harsh realities of female power in a period when a misstep could mean downfall or death. The emotional dimension of their lives is often overlooked in historical narratives focused on politics and drama. These women experienced deep joys and devastating losses, from childbirth and motherhood to betrayal and exile. Their letters, poetry, and recorded speeches reveal a rich inner life marked by love, fear, faith, and ambition. Understanding their emotional complexity allows us to see them as human beings grappling with circumstances far beyond their control, yet striving to maintain dignity and agency. Their legacies continue to shape perceptions of Tudor England and its monarchy. The enduring fascination with Henry VIII's wives reflects society's interest in the intersections of power, gender, and identity. Their stories challenge simplistic historical narratives and invite ongoing reevaluation. Modern scholarship and popular culture increasingly emphasize their individuality and contributions, moving beyond the cliches of victim, temptress, or martyr that have long defined them. Moreover, their experiences encourage us to explore lesser-known voices in history, the women and men who operated behind the scenes, whose stories have often been overshadowed by more famous figures. The maids of honor, ladies-in-waiting, tutors, and servants who supported the queens played crucial roles in court life, offering emotional support, facilitating political alliances, and sometimes engaging in espionage or intrigue. By examining these networks, we gain a fuller picture of Tudor society and the complexities of power and gender during this era. The lives of Henry VIII's wives remind us that history is not only about kings and battles, but also about the individuals who lived through these events with all their hopes, fears, and struggles. Their stories exemplify the ways in which personal and political histories intertwine, shaping the course of nations and the experiences of those who live within them. Recognizing their humanity invites us to consider how power operates in different forms and how individuals, especially women, navigate systems designed to limit them. In celebrating these queens as more than just wives, we acknowledge their roles as leaders, thinkers, and survivors. Their legacy is not confined to their marriages, but extends into the realms of culture, religion, and governance. They were architects of their own destinies as much as they were subjects of their time, and their lives continue to offer valuable lessons about resilience, agency, and the pursuit of legacy in the face of immense challenges. Ultimately, the stories of Henry VIII's wives inspire us to look deeper into history, to question who gets remembered and how, to listen for the voices that have been silenced, and to appreciate the complexity of those who lived through extraordinary times. Their lives urge us to explore history with empathy and curiosity, recognizing that behind every well-known figure lie countless untold stories waiting to be discovered.